name is Jamil Mawad, and I'm going to chair this panel today. And the panel is entitled Alternative Urban Ideas. And we have three papers. The first paper is going to be by Professor Dimitri Dalakoglu, and he's a professor of social anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. He's going to present a paper entitled Infrastructure Gap and the Future of Cities. And then the second paper is by Professor Farah Naqib, who's an assistant professor and the director of the Center for Gulf Studies at the American University of Kuwait. And she's going to present a paper entitled Restoring the Urban Commons, Youth Activism and the Appropriation of Public Space in Kuwait. And finally, we have a third paper by Professor Mona Harb entitled Cities and Political Change, How Young Activists in Beirut Bred Urban Social Movement. And Professor Harb is a professor at the university, at the American University. So we have 20 minutes each, and I'll make sure to stop you at 19.59 seconds.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here, and many thanks to the American University of Beirut for organizing this event and for the invitation. The title of the paper is Infrastructural Gap, and the things are not good. You know that, I know that, we all know that. But let's see what is the problem with Europe at the moment. There is an issue. Suddenly, Europe discovered 2 years ago a thing called refugee crisis. And we just wonder what is that refugee crisis. You know, people who study refugee phenomenon in the southeast border of Europe, like myself, know that the flows of people are, for many years now, the graveyards in Lesbos Island were full of people who died on their way to Greece, to Europe. So there was always this flow. But suddenly we discovered the refugee crisis. So there is a problem. The problem in Europe is that we have two territorial projects going on after the collapse of communism in 1989. The first project was the construction of real estate. Think now, at the end of Cold War, the private real estate in Europe was doubled at least, with all the privatization of Eastern Europe. And then we have this fever of constructing. The construction sector becomes, together with the financial sector, the steam engine of the European economy boom during the mid-90s and the mid-2000s. Ignacio already mentioned that in the case of Spain, and other speakers also in the case of other European countries. The other project that's going on is the border project. The border project of Europe. There is an exclusive, privileged European identity which is necessary during after the unification, supposedly, of Eastern and Western Europe, in order to create the new European identity. So suddenly, all these non-Europeans of whichever description are treated with much more hostility, much more like enemies, much more like outsiders. Now, we have a problem. The problem is that the European dream of the real estate, a house for everybody, the Generation X, as we say, cannot be materialized anymore due to the crisis which broke out in 2008 and hasn't been resolved yet. So the only project which keeps Europe together a bit, because Britain already escaped and other countries are going to escape soon, the European project is collapsing, the end is coming, fine, that's all right. But the problem, but for now, we're in states, which states is that of, the European project has only one spatial condition that can materialize, and that's the border one, the civilization of the common European border, which keeps people somehow united and governments also united in the case of Europe. So we are in that state, and that's why suddenly the refugee crisis emerged as a huge crisis. In order to show you what I mean by that, have a look to the construction index in Europe. I mean, up to 2006, 2007, were going up, and if you go back into the 90s, you will see that that was doubled as well. And then suddenly we fell, and that's it, right? It is pretty serious problem. If you want to know more about the serious problem we are facing, it's considered it was estimated by the International Energy Association that the European Union's energy sustainability is at stake unless we invest. All the European infrastructure companies, the construction sector in Europe, have seen their activities halved since the crisis. Many of them have closed. The so-called Juncker plan, the investment plan of the European Union of 2015, has one first priority, and that's infrastructures. Why? Because they recognize that there is infrastructural gap. But at the same sentence, basically when they say, we have a problem with our infrastructure, we are going to have power cuts and get prepared for blackouts in the core of Europe. In Amsterdam, we had a blackout in January, and everybody's like, oh, say, well, get used to it, guys. Because more of that coming. So but in the same sentence, when they say, we have infrastructural gap, and we must cover it, and we do throw some money, a few trillions, so a few billions only, we don't have much money as the European Union anymore. But the private sector needs to chip in. But as we all know, the hand of the market is invisible, and it's too invisible in that case because the market makes clear in all the authoritative sources of infrastructure market that they don't have the money to invest either. So guys, prepare for this infrastructural gap coming, and it's going to be a catastrophe. Now, if you want to see further estimations of that, the infrastructural gap, because this world is estimating everything in dollars for now, and in $1 trillion for 3 years more. Until China takes over. But meanwhile, yeah, we estimate that it's going to be by 2030, 57 trillion, with Europe being the one who is going to suffer the most. Why? Because during the boom period, mid-90s to mid-2000s, we created so many new infrastructures, we renewed massively all our infrastructures, partly in order to connect the two Europes, the Eastern and the Western, but not only was a connection, it was a reconstruction. Think here of the mega events. Europe saw three Olympic Games: Barcelona, London, Athens, after the collapse of socialism. All of them renovated, renewed completely the urban materialities through the well-known creative destruction projects of neoliberalism. Infrastructural gap, then if we were to define it briefly and superficially, it's a crisis of the existing model of producing infrastructures. The state and the private sector are the two greatest players in the infrastructural domain, are unable to finance any more the infrastructure the way we see them. I mean, yesterday, the keynote speaker also mentioned the Trump. Remember Trump? As soon as he wins the elections, the third sentence is, we will rebuild our infrastructures, because it's all around the West that we have infrastructural gap. In Europe, it's much more visible in soft infrastructures in Western Europe, right? Because in the European periphery, like Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece, or Italy, it's visible pretty much in the hard infrastructures. In the Northern Europe, it's mostly the soft infrastructures. Welfare, education, think here of Britain, right? The introduction of tuition fees in Britain, because basically it becomes a private matter to study in a university, one before it was a public participation there. Or state participation, or think that privatization of the national health system, and this goes on. But we have a paradigm shift of historical proportions. After the Second World War, we have what Graham calls the post-war infrastructural idea. The state is the provider of certain flows, of certain infrastructures, of certain provisions to the citizens, and that's the way they build consent. So that lasts until the 1970s, 1980s. We have a public-private partnership model where actually we just say, listen, the state is a bit useless and it's not very effective, so we need to introduce private sector's criteria and private sector's ideas and know-how in creating the infrastructures. And now we see the crisis of that model, and we have the creation of infrastructural gap. This is the new historical period in the history of infrastructures as we know them. It's starting. So the effects are not yet that visible in the core of Europe, but it is, we can see the various symbols. There are two reactions to that. There's a top-down reaction. You don't know this guy, I bet. It's not a small man in big chair. It is a normal man in big chair. He's the Dutch king. Right? The Dutch king was inaugurated in 2013. And in his inaugural lecture, he said, that's the end of the welfare state. Basically, I'm the new king, but fuck you all. There's no welfare state anymore. Forget anything you knew about the Netherlands. Now we need participatory society. So you take care of the elderly, you take care of your education, you take care of your health. The health system is already privatized 15 years ago, but it became an explicit political decision that basically do whatever you want, forget about the state. That's model of welfare is to be died. And of course, the last two British governments, they both won with the slogan of big society. By the way, big society not anymore used that much by Theresa May, the second term of Tories, but David Cameron's foundation is starting now, is going to drop a few £1 million in a big society project, and although the slogan is not used, the policies with the description, the content of the big society is out there. What is big society, participatory society? A way to provide soft infrastructures. This is the way that we're feeling it. Now, there is another reaction, which is a bottom-up reaction. This bottom-up reaction, we saw it a lot with the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. For over a year, there was hardly any state or supra-state or any institution of any description which took effectively care of the rescue, refugee welfare, and assistance on the spot. It took almost 12 months for the first serious effort of the United Nations High Commission of Refugees to address the issues which were going on. What happened during this year? You had the socio-technological innovation, from the use of social media to the use of special new platforms, online and offline ones, in order to mobilize thousands of volunteers, because it's not, I don't like the term volunteering, because it is not civil society what we show. We show a combination of technologies and local people, which would be from the local priest, which is not exactly big society, right? It's an institution, in fact. Local municipality, international anarchist volunteers from Germany, from No Border movement, and you saw all these people combining and taking care of the refugees. We saw similar things elsewhere. For example, Occupy Sunday functioned in a very similar way, right? The whole East Coast, the state basically had nothing, right? It was taking austerity the welfare. As soon as the superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast, basically in the East Coast, the whole welfare and rescue and operations were taking care, providing food, providing shelter to thousands of displaced people, was carried out by Occupy Sunday, which was coming out of Occupy Wall Street, and then, by now has taken a different form. So it is something which we see it a lot as bottom-up reaction. Now, why am I studying Greece? There's an easy answer to that, which you can guess, but forget about it. There's a more difficult answer, which is that it's a lack of infrastructure participation. In almost the entire area of that wide diversity, we are calling infrastructure. Because infrastructure is a term which I don't like at all. And that's I have a critique for Abdulmalik Simon and for Dennis' use of the term as well this morning. We shouldn't use it for everything. I think that it is already so wide that it's pretty much hollow already. Because it's infrastructure, a port or an airport, it's infrastructure, highway, it's infrastructure, the health system, right? So we need to think a bit to go back to the original social theory. But let me say, for example, water. In Thessaloniki, for example, there is this entire movement which is not only against the privatization of the water resources, but it's also suggesting the socialization of the sewage and the water provision infrastructure. So the materiality, not only the flows, but the materiality of the network is to be socialized. Roads. Roads were the victim of the first and most important victim of the so-called I don't pay movement. This challenged the model of public partnership, basically after they privatized the highway system in Greece, which started in a little bit before the crisis as part of this public-private partnership project, I believe in 2007 became a bit more legal, but became really, so they created the toll. So basically automatically makes a disagreement between a driver who don't pay and a company which manages the road a civil matter. So it's not a felony. So if you don't say, fuck off, I'm not gonna pay, and go, they will have to sue you and come after you because a traffic officer cannot arrest you, policeman will not arrest you. It's not a felony, it's not a crime anymore. It is something between two civil persons who will disagree about something. This lasts for a few years, so millions of drivers not paying the tolls. Basically, the private company will you promised us millions of profit and we are operating on loss. Well, they will do nothing. They were not really operating on loss. They were operating on less profits. But we were having just this, and eventually they created a law which banned it. However, the whole movement of I Don't Pay was suggesting an alternative way of managing the motorway system, which would be, again, municipal cooperatives, which would take care of the various structures within the municipality. Garbage, since we talked already about garbage in Beirut, previous speakers as well, Mykonos, which probably you may know as a nice holiday destination, had always a problem with garbage. These days, Mykonos has one of the first cooperative recycling recycling garbage plant. Remember, be careful. I'm not talking about a cooperative administration of an existing phenomenon. I talk about people who come together. So the superstructure precedes the infrastructure. It's an infrastructure which creates the cultural and social superstructure. It is a social and cultural and political, which comes together in unions to operate for various dimensions, and then they eventually go and take materiality, which is infrastructural materiality, and they provide an infrastructural provision from scratch. So they don't take over an existing infrastructure and say, let's administrate a bit differently. They start creating new ones. Or think of health, over 40 social clinics and pharmacies all around Greece, social solidarity clinics, and these is again a different model of providing public health care. Education, again, social and solidarity, educational system. I can't tell you more details if anybody is fantastically brilliant and wants to know more details and ask me after the questions. But another example, for example, is Sivnos Island Green Energy Cooperative. Again, a similar point, a cooperative which starts as a social project and then eventually decides that they need to produce energy because they have problems. So now they're of energy in the islands, and now they are creating this green energy, so windmills to start producing energy for the island, and they created an association of other islands, so cooperatives providing energy in very affordable, or for example, the first self-organized hydroelectric 5 minutes. Oh, I have plenty of time. I don't even need time. I'm sorry, I was panicking, so I can't speak a bit slower. I can't breathe. Okay. So we have already the first self-organized. I don't even know who's this word. We basically have now the first self-organized power plant, hydroelectric power plant. Already it's running in North Greece in Belvedere, which is this place. It's started by the local cooperative of farmers, and they start producing energy in order, and it's basically a bit complicated. I can't explain you the details of it, but they're selling it to the electrical company, which in fact covers the cost of operating the pumps, because they water their fields with pumps, which cost lots of money in electricity to run them. So they couldn't afford it anymore, and they were like, we either stop being farmers, so we don't produce anymore, or we grasp the energy available to us through the waterfall, and they created a self-organized plant, right? Power plant. Let me say the motivation behind all this research. The motivation is simple. Always you have someone, I'm not going to give names, someone will come and what are you going to do after the revolution then? If you communist, anarchist, whatever, you take over the world, who's going to build the roads? Or who's going to produce the energy? So that's the motivation a bit behind this project, because that's what I was looking for. And it's a question which I often found myself not able to answer through other instances, non-academic instances, but political instances, where actually we need to provide an answer of how do you start creating from scratch infrastructures. So infrastructure participation is an innovative socio-technological network based on ideas of commons and mechanisms of sharing, solidarity, and social economy, and they create a novel domain which goes beyond civil society, state, or market. So there are at least 3 types of innovation which need to be justified in order to talk about participatory infrastructure. The first one is socio-technological innovation. We talk about hybrids, right? We don't talk exactly about purely social operations which take then the material states. It's a combination of the two. We talk about social solidarity, commons, ideals, and ideological innovation which is going on. And then we talk, which, be careful, it's not political innovation. The majority of these projects are run by people who are not the experts of social movements, right? These things are, in theory, they're like very promising for the whole left, for the whole anarchist, it's like, wow, that's very impressive. Look, people, well, these people don't operate, they don't have an ideological reading of what they're doing, which is very important, that's why the country. Because ideology often becomes problematic because you start interpreting the world through the ideology and rather than practice. So, what is that 1 minute? I took too much time. 20. So yes, that's an important thing. And there is 2 projects which are going on then in order to talk about infrastructural participation. The first one is that we are challenging the previous model, the existing model. We protest, we blockade, right? We create interruptions in the model, which could be from bombs and Molotov cocktails against the new garbage plans of Athens, as it happened in Keratea outside Athens, or can be just a challenge like a referendum in Thessaloniki, where the referendum decides that the water system needs to go and become socialized. Thank you very much. I finished.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, echoing everybody else, I'd like to thank Muna and Muna for inviting me to speak today on a different kind of example of an urban landscape or an urban environment, and that is Kuwait. So in his book, Rebel Cities, David Harvey argues that the urban privatization, the creation of spatial enclaves, controls over the use of space, and other urban processes that primarily serve capitalist class and or state interests negatively impact the quality of urban life and social relations in cities across the world. But even as the diverse spaces of the city are subject to enclosure, control, and appropriation, he says, the human quality, quote, the human qualities of the city emerge out of our practices in those spaces. Such social practices in public spaces contribute to the creation of an urban common, which does not simply refer to common property resources or even necessarily to collective spaces that all city residents share. Harvey makes an important distinction between public spaces, streets, sidewalks, squares, and public goods, sanitation, water, public health, education on the one hand, and the urban common on the other. While the former are, of course, commonly shared, it takes political action on the part of the people, not the state, to appropriate such public spaces or public goods and make them part of the common. The common is not to be construed, he says, as a particular kind of thing, asset, or even social process, but as an unstable and malleable social relation between a particular self-defined social group and those aspects of its actually existing or yet to be created social and or physical environment deemed crucial to its life and livelihood. There is then a social practice of commoning, a struggle by particular social groups to access, appropriate, and use the public spaces and public goods of the city for a common purpose. But not all forms of the common created by this process are necessarily accessible to all. Some may be produced and established exclusively for use by a particular group, such as a housing enclave created by and for the rich, while others may be partially or fully open to all, such as a community garden. The common, therefore, takes multiple forms, and different social groups can engage in the practice of commoning for different purposes. Harvey, therefore, raises the question as to which social groups or commoning struggles should be supported and which, if any, should be resisted. Kuwait provides an interesting lens through which to unpack what exactly the common is and how it can be created. Although Kuwait's hydrocarbon resources are considered common property shared by all citizens, the state's distribution of wealth in the form of goods and services removes oil resources from the realm of the common, along with the urban spaces and social relations produced by oil. Again, the common is created by political action of the people, not the state. With the advent of oil urbanization in 1950, Kuwait underwent a rapid state-led modernization process that resulted in the complete transformation of the urban landscape. Urban planning and development after 1950 were entirely state-led processes and did not include any form of public participation or involvement in the production of the built environment. Kuwait's first master plan, approved in 1952, divided the city-state into functional zones. So the city center was remade into a financial and bureaucratic hub, which is this part just up in here. While the inhabitants of the old city were relocated en masse to new residential suburbs outside the old city wall, which are those blocks that you see with the black squares in between. Leisure, commerce, and industry were also removed from the city center and located in designated zones around the suburbs. The result of this modernist planning process, implemented over the first 3 decades of oil, was a city center that was described by the mid-1990s as a ghost town that was empty after working hours. State buildings, palaces, and financial institutions replaced residential, commercial, and other social spaces. The 1952 plan also determined that Kuwait, quote, Kuwait is destined to be one of the largest and most important towns in the Middle East, and its roads can be one of its finest features, end quote. The plan made no provisions for a public transportation network, and the city was thus, as one planner working in the country in the 1960s put it, quote, condemned to worship the automobile. The wide distance between residential, work, and leisure zones made walking an impossible mode of everyday mobility. The master plan also made little provision for public parking, and most visible sidewalks and open spaces in the city center and suburbs alike became used as improvised parking lots, which further hindered pedestrians' ability to get from one point to the next, which is a reality that still exists today for any of you who have been to Kuwait. In Kuwait, as in most cities around the world, quote, before the car came along, streets were often a common, a place of popular sociality, a play space for kids, end quote. But the dominance of the private automobile destroyed that common and turned streets into spaces that were impossible to use for social or communal purposes. Wide streets like the Arabian Gulf Road also cut people off from other more socially conducive public spaces like the seafront. This loss of the common was exacerbated by the privatization of the seafront, which from the 1970s onwards was carved up into private beach clubs with expensive memberships, resort hotels, shopping malls, restaurant clusters, and marinas, leaving only a few stretches of public beach and grassy sections of the landscaped corniche open to non-commodified public use. State planning authorities did create some open public spaces scattered throughout the city center in the 70s and 80s. For instance, the Sahat al-Safat, the Safat Square, which was the old city square before oil, was remade into a designed plaza in the heart of the central business district in 1983. However, as the Kuwaiti architect Reem Al-Isa argues, quote, most Kuwaitis and affluent expatriates ignore officially designated public space for the socially and climatically controlled spaces of malls and corporate plazas. Open spaces come public space, which allow for marketable, design and contrived diversity, as opposed to uncontrolled social interaction that might hinder exchange value, end quote. So in the new fragmented, segregated, and increasingly privatized everyday life that oil produced, Kuwaitis' encounters and public interactions with different groups from outside their own social world significantly diminished as they withdrew into more self-contained and self-sustaining suburban lifestyles, resulting in a notoriously insular, divided, and increasingly xenophobic society. So Harvey argues that, quote, through their daily activities and struggles, individuals and social groups create the social world of the city and thereby create something common as a framework within which all can dwell, end quote. In Kuwait, however, the city became a product of state-led planning from which people were increasingly estranged, rather than a social space created by the activities and practices of diverse individuals and groups. Today, however, new social forces have finally begun to counter the hegemonic and socially stultifying practices of the state-led and capital-driven urbanization that has characterized the last 6 decades since the advent of oil, to envision new ways of re-inhabiting public spaces in Kuwait's highly privatized and controlled urban landscape, and therefore to create an urban common. For instance, elsewhere I've written about the occupation of a public green space across the Arabian Gulf Road from the Parliament building in Kuwait City by political activists in 2006 and again in 2011. From young bloggers demanding electoral reform to anti-government forces calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister on grounds of corruption, and from women's activists to Bidoon or stateless rights campaigners, protesters of all stripes have transformed this space into a political commons, which Harvey describes as a place for open discussion and debate over what power is doing and how best to oppose its reach. This example demonstrates the difference between a public space and a common. This grassy space sitting between a state-run heritage village and a public parking lot existed before 2006, but it became part of the urban common once people began to gather there to express their political views and make demands, when it was unofficially renamed Sahat al-Irada, or Determination Square, by protesters. Now, while some of the following examples of commoning in Kuwait also entail the appropriation of public spaces for common purposes, they also constitute what Joanna Bachman describes in her discussion of Washington, D.C.'s cooperative movement as, quote, social activities involved in production and community building, and experiments in living that we create together, end quote. As new forms of social experimentation, these struggles collectively contest and counter decades of economic and cultural privatization, social alienation, and public apathy among Kuwaitis. And although some of the examples that I'll be sharing here today might seem a little bit trivial or inconsequential, for a city like Kuwait that is truly highly segregated and highly privatized, some of these new movements are very new and novel and noteworthy for a city like Kuwait and for most Gulf cities. So two categories of such commoning processes can be identified in Kuwait today. One is an attempt to reconstitute the city center itself into a vast common, a collective product of its citizens rather than solely a product of state-led planning. Since 2005, the city center has become increasingly attractive to local small businesses, leading to both an economic revitalization of the central business district for the first time in decades, and a growing public interest in participatory urban development. However, this reclamation of the city center has both positive and negative outcomes, and thus reveals the complex and multifaceted consequences of commoning practices, where certain social groups may create a common for their own exclusive access rather than to be open for use by all. Now, I've written about these movements elsewhere in my work, so for the remainder of my talk today, I'd like to focus instead on what I see as a potentially more effective practice of commoning, in which, again, quoting Harvey, quote, the relation between the social group and that aspect of the environment being treated as a common is both collective and non-commodified, off limits to the logic of market exchange and market valuations, end quote. The groups that I put into this category of commoning in Kuwait are nebulous and hard to define. They're not private businesses or formal NGOs, but collectively form part of a new urban activism that is distinct and highly interactive. The groups share common goals and are mutually supportive. They promote community building and experiment with new ways of living and being in Kuwait that challenge existing state laws and public norms. Many of their activities have been officially restricted or resisted, and yet they've garnered much public support in their initiatives. At the core of this movement is what's known in Kuwait as the Secret Garden, which began when a small group of Kuwaiti and non-Kuwaiti volunteers took over a derelict 2,000 square meter garden, officially called Baghdad Park, in the mixed commercial and residential district of Salmiya, and turned it into a vibrant community gardening project. Based entirely on the work of a diverse group of volunteers, the Secret Garden became Kuwait's first example of unplanned cooperative urbanism. As a public green space, the park technically comes under the auspices of the Public Authority for Agricultural Affairs and Fish Resources, which governs all public green spaces in Kuwait, and which in 2015 officially appointed 3 active volunteers as custodians of the garden on behalf of the institution. Among the public, the person most closely associated with the Secret Garden is Maryam al-Nislif, who's sitting right there in that first image. But while willingly taking the lead in maintaining the space, these 3 volunteers and the groups that they work with are adamant about not controlling the garden and giving everyone equal rights of access to it. The purpose of the Secret Garden to Maryam and her friends and neighbors was simultaneously environmental and social. Environmentally, they wanted to experiment with and promote more sustainable methods of planting and growing in Kuwait, which to counter the fact that Kuwait is one of the highest consumption of water resources in the world, including using native trees that were on the verge of becoming obsolete, and to encourage young people to learn how to grow and be more connected to their natural environment. So, for instance, they dug a compost pit in one sector and used mostly upcycled materials and donated or found objects throughout the garden, including, at one time, a toilet bowl used as a planter. Socially, they wanted to create a neighborhood space that bridged the gap between Salmiya's Kuwaiti and non-Kuwaiti residents, which it did, again, which is very unique in a city that is very heavily segregated. And to create the kind of public space that Andy Merrifield describes as, quote, a vibrant, open public forum full of lived moments and enchanting encounters, end quote. They encouraged the use of the garden for free public neighborhood events that anyone could organize and attend, and many, such as cooking classes by many people who lived in the neighborhood, theater workshops, and other things were held. In April 2016, they teamed up with a new local nonprofit organization called Basla, which focuses on buying, selling, and donating clothing, home goods, and books to help people in need in Kuwait, mostly migrant laborers. One of Basla's initiatives are these walls of kindness that you see here, the first of which was set up in the Secret Garden, which is the top left one, and are now found throughout the city and suburbs, particularly in areas where migrant laborers live. The idea behind the walls was simple. Local artists were invited to paint them, and then several pegs and shelves are inserted on which people can donate clothes. By their own admission, Basla specifically encourages middle and higher class Kuwaitis to downsize their closets full of rarely worn clothes this way. So anyone can put clothes up on the wall, and anyone passing by can take whatever they like off. So the walls, particularly in an area like the Secret Garden, sends a message to the many low-income workers who often cut through the park as they walk towards Baghdad Street that they're welcome in the garden, that they have a stake in the space and should not feel the need to avoid it or rush through it now that it has been cleaned up and is used by Kuwaitis and largely middle-class non-Kuwaitis. So the walls of kindness are rare spaces that both elites who donate their clothes and laborers who can take them are meant deliberately to interact with. Basla's objective is therefore more than simple charity. They're experimenting with how people think about, collectively use, and experience public space in Kuwait. The Secret Garden volunteers also began hosting a small street market every other Saturday called Shakshuka, where a limited number of vendors sold food, produce, food, and homemade products to neighbors and visitors, accompanied by live music. Maryam had actually started this market as Shakshuka as a small farmer's market well before the Secret Garden because her family owns a small organic farm. So with the goal being the promotion of local agriculture and food production, the Shakshuka vendors never wanted to commercialize the market by holding it on private property, particularly as they wanted to keep it publicly accessible and affordable to diverse visitors. However, strict laws restricting the use of public land for commercial purposes in Kuwait meant that for years, the handful of vendors operated as a sort of guerrilla market, setting up in a different place each week and only announcing the location the morning of the event on social media. And that way they were largely able to avoid state obstruction. Maryam was mostly concerned with protecting the non-Kuwaiti vendors who would be more at risk of being arrested. When the Secret Garden came to life, it made sense to make it Shakshuka's permanent home. So in addition to promoting small local businesses, including the home businesses of many of Salmia's own residents, the volunteers were able to use the market vendors' fees to maintain the garden. However, once state authorities caught wind of the market, they attempted to stop it, invoking the law against using public land for commercial purposes. The volunteers were resilient and refused to back down, and finally in May 2016, they managed to get official permission to hold the market in the garden, an unprecedented move that could have considerably loosened the state's control over how people can use public space in Kuwait, which was, of course, the goal. But the official in charge at the public authority kept waffling in his decisions, and things finally took a surprising turn this past fall. Now, the gardening activities naturally subsided during the extremely hot summer months from June to September, particularly as many of the volunteers were out of town. They knew that most of the flowers and plants would die in the summer heat, so they donated most of them out. So the garden began to look derelict again, and from the volunteers' perspective, that was only to be expected, and they had every intention of reviving it again once the weather cooled. But before they had a chance to do so, in October 2016, municipality bulldozers came in and tore up everything the volunteers had created, the wooden planters, the artificial irrigation swales that they had built, and so on. And the officials told Maryam that they had allowed the park to fall into disrepair and be vandalized and were not doing their job as custodians of the space. Most people, though, suspected that this was really a personal attack against the volunteers because of the conflict over the market. Over the next few weekends, hundreds of volunteers from the general public of all ages, nationalities, and backgrounds responded to a social media campaign to come out and help restore the garden. But the municipality officially put an end to Shakshuka in the garden, and that had been key to bringing people to the garden and making them realize its value as a community space. Though the market has relocated, the garden has somewhat gone back to being a relatively dead space when the gardeners aren't working, which was probably the intention of state authorities who seemed bent on exhausting the volunteers into abandoning their adamant appropriation of the park. Another space became that became a center of public activism and contention over the past year is Beit Lodhan, a large pre-oil courtyard house that for decades served as a community arts center. In February 2016, it was announced that Beit Lodhan was going to be demolished to make way for a new shopping mall, leading to unprecedented public outrage. An online petition to save the place received thousands of signatures over the first few hours, and protest gatherings attracted large numbers of people at the site over the next few weeks. Beit Lodhan had been home to a variety of cultural activities. It held free public classes in art, photography, and film, provided a large rent-free space to a volunteer-based youth bookstore, and its courtyards were used for free public performances and exhibitions. It was also home to the Lodhan Youth Achievement Center, an NGO dedicated to empowering youth, Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, by, quote, helping them find their sense of purpose by extending themselves to others. So besides being a historic building, Beit Lodhan was one of the few spaces that people of all backgrounds actively used and enjoyed in Kuwait without any hint of commercialism involved, an unconventional space that was truly public and diverse. The public outrage against its demolition, and particularly its planned replacement with a mall, demonstrates that people really crave these kinds of spaces of public interaction in Kuwait. The movement to save Beit Lodhan triggered the creation of a group called Al-Amakin 1746, which aims to not only protect historic buildings, but also to reinvent and reintegrate diverse urban spaces as public spaces. It should not come as any surprise that many people involved in Al-Amakin are also involved in the Secret Garden and or Shakshuka. In fact, one of the first protests at Beit Lodhan was preceded by 2 hours of gardening and then a candlelit march from the garden to the house as a way of, quote, engaging the community to reconnect with our public spaces and green areas, end quote. Al-Amakin worked tirelessly for months navigating between Beit Lodhan's property owners, who are members of the ruling family, and state institutions like the municipality and the National Council for Culture, Arts and Letters to get the building protected from demolition. And they're getting close. It's not done yet, but it's getting close. But if successful, Beit Lodhan will represent an unprecedented moment in which public interests supersede private financial interests in Kuwait. But like the Secret Garden and Shakshuka, Al-Amakin 1746 continues to come up against numerous state obstructions, oscillations, and hostility. However, all of these examples represent a new kind of urban activism in Kuwait, led by people who are in it for the long haul and are refusing to give in to pressure or stick to the status quo. They sometimes lose momentum, particularly as everyone involved has day jobs and can only do this kind of work, which takes a tremendous amount of time, will, and energy on a voluntary and part-time basis. But there's an amazing synergy between these groups and several others that I've been observing but haven't had a chance to speak about today that are slowly transforming Kuwait into the kind of city, quote, where people of all sorts and classes mingle, however reluctantly and agonistically, to produce a common, if perpetually changing and transitory life. Thank you.
Okay, so today I'm going to tell you the story of urban activists, a story I've been writing for the past 2 years as part of a project that's funded by the EU FP7 framework and that actually transformed the paper as I was writing it, given much of what happened in the last 2 years. So, we've been talking a lot about neoliberal urbanization, and I've been thinking who's going to unpack that. So it's not going to be me. I guess that will happen tomorrow with some of the speakers. I'll leave that for another person to do it. So in this context that we've been discussing since yesterday evening, in this context of neoliberal urbanization, necropolitics, inequalities, and shrinking commons, the question I'd like to ask is, under what conditions can urban activism lead to an organized collective action or an urban social movement that impacts political change? And to answer this question, I'm looking at the case of urban activism in Beirut, and I ask specifically 3 sets of questions. How did urban issues become a main concern of contentious politics over the past decade or so? What are these conditions that allowed urban issues to become the common denominator for different activist coalitions and NGOs who organized collectively in a municipal campaign into 2016 by the name of Beirut Madinati, Beirut My City, for those who don't know the meaning of it? And can this collective action sustain into a durable urban social movement capable of political change? So my answers to this are up there. So this is what I'm going to try to demonstrate in the 20 minutes or so that I have. And the argument is that there are three sets of interdependent conditions that explain the transformation of urban activism into an urban social movement. First, the making of a shared urban imaginary that bred together an accumulated knowledge of 2 generations of urban activists. I think there are perhaps 3 even, but we can discuss this later. And several success stories. I'll talk about this briefly. The second set of condition is the intra-elite competition in Lebanon that led to antagonistic urban policies, which provoked cracks in the system and rewired activist network in a way that brought them together. And the third is the fact that it's happening in a city, in Beirut, where there's a high diversity, density, and proximity of activists, which make up relational assets and place-based networks of trust and solidarity that lead to this movement. So why does this matter? Are all my research methods students here? Okay, so that's the famous so what question, who cares? Okay, so I think that this, actually we have class today, so you should be here. So, so I think this is important. Why this is important? Because I think within this very bleak environment we live in of neoliberal urbanization, where there is no hope left, I think that cracking the system, even temporarily, is important because it gives us hope and meaning. And I think we can, again, discuss this later if you'd like. So even if things are not altered structurally yet, the openings in the system can coalesce and lead to some more durable change, perhaps. So, and this challenges at least 2 sets of assumptions in the scholarship that I've relied on in my work in this EU project where this is extracted from. The first is the fact that in the literature, urban social movements, specifically in developing countries, the literature agrees that there's no room for political change because we're stuck between a clientelistic system that's very good at reproducing itself and at crushing any activist movement from developing. So activist movement will remain external to the political system. And this is corroborated by work on Lebanon, namely a book written by Bassel Salloukh and his students in 2016, which shows very well how NGOs and activists in Lebanon have become professional businesses and are depoliticized. The second body of literature which says there's no way out is that the youth are apathetic, depoliticized, and passive group, which is not really interested in politics, and that they're not the engine of change like we see elsewhere. There are other also scholarship that we might mobilize in this argument, but I'll keep to those 2. So the way I'm framing this is I'm relying on urban sociology and urban social movement theory, as well as literature on collective action and urban life in Lebanon. And I've been following these movements and these activist groups for the past 10 years, largely as a participant observer, but also I've done interviews with a number of these activists, a lot of desk research, and a lot of available data. So the story is will go as follows. I'll briefly, just to make sure that everyone is on the same wavelength, talk briefly about urbanism and political economy in Lebanon, just to situate the context. Tell how a shared urban imaginary emerged over the past 2 decades. The moment when intra-elite competition takes place and antagonistic urban policies lead to major cracks in the system, which allows the diversity of activists and that are in proximity and who form a density to come together in a social movement that is first geared towards protest and that then from which emerges the municipal campaign of Beirut Madinati, which I argue can be read as an urban social movement. So urbanism in Lebanon is mainly operated via top-down policies. They're decided by a few, and they're mostly in the service of the ruling oligarchy, like Fawaz Trabulsi names it. As of the 1990s, so after the civil war in Lebanon, which goes on for 15 years, the period of what has been qualified as Harirism by the name of the Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri makes it really worse, this oligarchy and how it functions. It's pretty much, I would say, symbolized by the real estate project Solidaire, which consolidates the practice of neoliberal urbanism, and a set of economic policies in the mid-90s that Trabulsi describes as being the rentierization of economy. This leads to heightened unemployment, the increased immigration of skilled labor, a heightened influx of unskilled labor, and inflation. And this has very largely materialized in the real estate sector. The deals in 2012 amount to 9.2 billion. So it gives you an idea about how this translates in the built environment in the city. It also translates into major spatial and socioeconomic inequalities we talked about. That's largely since yesterday. We mainly have a monopolistic economic structure that concentrates the wealth in the hand of a very few holding companies, and they enjoy wide tax breaks and no custom duties. The Gini coefficient in Lebanon, according to a famous Credit Suisse study, quoted in Executive Magazine, placed it at 86.3, and I think Mona mentioned it in her opening, half of the personal wealth in Lebanon belongs to a mere 0.3% of the adult population, so less than 9,000 individuals. So that's some numbers just to show you how drastic inequality is here. Within that context, we have a first generation of urban activists that speak against this. This is the early 1990s, and they speak mainly against the real estate project of Solidaire. This has been well written in the literature, so I won't dwell on it, but I'll mention it briefly, and you can refer to writings on this. I can mention a few. So these are, I would say, our professors, my generation. Like, this is how we learned critical urban studies from Asim Salam, Jad Thabit, Nabil Bayhum, and George Karam. They wrote 4 books against Solidaire at the time, published by Dar al-Jadid, and each one was critiquing a particular dimension of the project and Harirism, what comes with it. So these books sent a major, I would say, discourse, and there were a lot of debates and discourse about what happened then, and they trained the generation of urbanists who were studying at the time. This is, I would argue, how the urban imaginary begins, that shared urban imaginary. So this continues with the fact that programs in urban planning, urban design get established in universities in Lebanon in the mid-1990s. Before that, we didn't have urban programs teaching urban planning and design or urban studies. We still don't have urban studies in Lebanon. But the way these programs get taught is that they introduce a lot of critical urban studies in the pedagogy, relatively. So you have programs that open first at Alba in the Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts, then at AUB, then at the Lebanese University, then at the Notre Dame University, then at Beirut Arab University. So you can imagine they recruit professors who teach urban studies. They teach a new generation of urban students studying urban planning and studies. In addition to the fact that we have programs that are disseminating understandings of critical urban studies, we also have a context where we live in a region where wars happen very regularly and that have a dire impact on cities and towns and regions. So this translates also in our classrooms, in our seminars, in our discussions. We have debates about them, but we also go on the field and seek to intervene to rebuild, reconstruct, think about these processes. And we did this a lot at AUB, and I'll show you how this happened in a few slides. So all this creates a lot of social networks between people. We train students who meet other students who create networks of knowledge and learning. This is also disseminated further through social media and digital communication, and it consolidates into academic programs, but also NGOs, coalitions, and campaigns. So the program here, the MUP-MUD program that organizes city debates, is one of those major platforms that bring together all the people you have here, that have conversations that are continued beyond the walls of the conference itself and beyond the classroom. They also lead up to the formation of organizations like Public Works, you heard Nadine Bekdash this morning, Legal Agenda, you heard Nizar Saghiye this morning, and Nahnu, which is another organization that takes care of public space, Green Line, and other initiatives. These initiatives all come together actually from one network, I would argue, of people who met in one of these venues and who ended up establishing their own platforms through which they disseminate their ideas about the rights to the city, about public space, about protecting the coast, about protecting the commons. So all this accumulates in a body of reflective urban practice within the universities and in civil society organizations and beyond, and leads to several success stories of urban activism. And it forms the second generation of urban activists against neoliberal urbanism that seek to build the common in the city of, namely Beirut. So a few images to show you what are these platforms about. So you're in one of the city debates, but the city debates has been going on since 2003, and it has grown into what it is today. So, and along the lines, it has inspired, I would say, many urban activists. In 2006, there was the Israeli war on Lebanon, which led a group of students and professors at AUB to establish the Reconstruction Unit, which had a lot of work done in the towns and the cities of Lebanon that were destroyed by the war. Their experiences got documented in a book edited by Huwaida Al-Harithi, Lessons in Post-War Reconstruction, which also tells the stories of these urban activists. One of the authors in the book is a graduate of our program, Rabia Shibli, worked with what became the Center for Civic Engagement at AUB, which he now directs. All the authors in this book have led up to the establishment of major activist initiatives. Ismail, Sheikh Hassan here, Nadine and Abir ended up doing other projects, and I'm sure I'm forgetting people, but if you trace back the trajectory of who wrote in this book, you'd see that they led up to major initiatives that are impacting today the city in many, many ways. What we also do at AUB is disseminate ideas and debates about the city. So these are two publications that were done by Muna Fawaz, Ahmed Gharbiye, and the students of the graduate program, published in Arabic, that disseminate ideas about security and public space. And again, the purpose is to bring these discourses in the public sphere and to disseminate the urban discourse in a more common space. So among these activist organization, I would single out three that had a positive impact and that changed practice. And I think these three success stories have sent very positive messages among the community of urban activists, and that created a lot of learning and circulation of successful tools that they learned from. This major success tool is the fact that it's grounded in research, and specifically in legal research. We heard a lot about this morning with Legal Agenda and the role of the judicial sphere in advancing the cause of urban activists. So the first is the Fuad Boutros Park campaign, Stop the Highway, Build the Fuad Boutros Park, which was established by a group of students who are graduates from here. That was this was a mobilization against the highway that was to cut across the Bar Mkhail neighborhood in the eastern part of the city in Ashrafiyeh. And what the activists did is to propose a counter project for this. And what they did also is to impose on the municipality, which was leading the project, the municipality of Beirut, to do an environmental impact assessment study, which halted the project. So this first success, which was also the work of a multitude of activists in the background, professors at UB, urban designers in their offices, sent a message that things can be done if we lobby and we're active. The second success story is the reopening of the Harsh Beirut Park, which was closed for a variety of reasons, mainly political. I don't have time to go into. So this is the largest park in the city. And after years of lobbying by the Nahnu NGO and other urban activists that associated with it, the park reopened a year ago. First on once a week on Saturdays, and then during I think all the weekends, and now it's open all the time. Although it just closed again because of another story, but. Again, that's another paper, so I won't discuss what's happening now, but Harsh Beirut did reopen for the population after a lot of lobbying by the Nahnu NGO. The third is the civil campaign to protect Dalia, which is the coastal part of the city on Rawshe, which has a major ecological value, and this was led by a group of activists by the name of the Civil Campaign to Protect Dalia, who worked again with the same networks of urban activists, relying a lot on legal research, property papers, and who managed to place Dalia on the World Monument Fund watch in 2016, and who proposed a series of alternative occupation of the land through an international ideas competition that was held at the time. So these three success stories show us that there is a major movement of urban activists that emerged in Lebanon, in Beirut specifically, over the past decade, that learned, that made an impact on the level of urban policy, that managed to halt projects that were going against the commons and the right to the city. When I first started writing about these urban activists, the version of the paper I presented, I think in November 2015 or in the spring 2015, ended with a question saying, how will these urban activists coalesce and come together? And in August 2015, there was a major garbage crisis in Lebanon, and about 100,000 people went down to the streets to protest against that garbage crisis, and a lot of all the urban activists I was talking about were in the streets, and suddenly I saw that they came together, and so the paper morphed into that. Now that they coalesced, why did it happen now? And the element that I added to the list of conditions was the fact that our elites, our oligarchy, they were not agreeing on how to distribute the spoils of the garbage concession. And so while they were disagreeing on how to distribute the pie among themselves, there was a window of opportunity for activists to act that was prompted very much by the fact that garbage was on the streets. And when we talk about garbage on the street, it stinks. It really stinks. It's not something that you can ignore, and you can find a plan B for it. You can't have another way of disposing of your garbage. So the delegitimized leadership, I don't have the time to go into how the leadership in Lebanon got majorly delegitimized after 2011 and the Syrian refugee crisis that accelerated this delegitimization process. But we are really in a situation where we had soaring inequalities. I mentioned that, failure of basic services and infrastructure, and the collapse of that intra-elite agreement over waste management that led to exposing the oligarchy, exposing rentierization and corruption. A famous image that toured social media at the time. During the crisis, what happened is that we removed all the garbage bags and placed them on the banks of the Beirut River. Okay, so Cracks in the system was a major opportunity for activist network to coalesce and come together and to lead a major social movement by the name of Al-Hirak, which is a translation of movement, which means movement in Arabic, and that brought down I think for the first time after the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri in 2005, Lebanese together over an issue-based protest that had the slogan of Kullun yani Kullun, so that mobilized again all the sectarian political parties and all the oligarchy. So this movement did not go very far because it got policed, repressed, divided, and co-opted. Classic tactics of the state to control these movements. Can I have 2 more minutes? Yeah. Yeah. That's the authority of being in the scientific. I'll take that. Okay, just 2 more minutes. Okay, so Al-Hirak subsided, and several groups tried to reorganize. One of them eyed the forthcoming municipal elections in May 2016 and mobilized into a municipal campaign by the name of Beirut Madinati. So as of November 2015, the urban activists I was mentioning earlier got together with other activists from other spheres, people who were working in human rights, legal rights, civil rights, political rights, feminist groups, LGBTQ groups. They came together and they set up a loose network of individuals who decided to wage the municipal campaign in 2016. This is a screenshot from the website of Beirut Madinati, which you can consult. It also exists, and everything is translated into English, so you can see on it the program and all the details about what the campaign did. So Beirut Madinati was very much like bringing together a cosmopolitan culture and shared understanding among individuals who shared this urban imaginary of a city that would have a common and a sense of a belonging and inclusion and participation. Its biography was quite mixed in terms of age, gender. There were a lot of friends among them, people who knew each other from before, who were activists together, people who are very media savvy, educated, cyber active, mostly middle class and mobile. And all this helped enormously to provide access to financial resources, material resources, symbolic resources, and provided a lot of trust and accountability. Their agenda was clearly urban. Their name shows it. They had a program that were very much inspired from the livability literature, urban livability literature, and rooted in the right to the city framework. This is really the core of the program, which was reliant on 10 points that, again, you can consult through the website. Their strategies resemble very much what we've heard this morning about other urban social movements, so a decentralized structure, a loose organization, leadership that was very much polycentric, different groups of people that were eager to intervene on local action and to be independent. They had a strong propensity for working on the neighborhood level and to use social media to expand their constituency. They were self-funded, and they produced a list of 24 very ordinary city dwellers that looked like your average Beiruti citizen, although we can discuss this later. Some images of the neighborhood initiatives they did in parks, we did in parks. Social media, that was a major tool behind their success. Videos of endorsers that helped disseminate their message, and the list, the 24 candidates that ran, and that include several urban activists among them. So Beirut Madinati lost but it scored a very honorable score of 32% against major odds. This is really huge given the very limited resources we had at the time and the fact that we prepared very little. So if we were in a proportional electoral system, we would have 8 candidates sitting in the municipal council today. So this is not a small victory. This is something that people look at and try to learn from. And this is really why I'm talking about it today, because Beirut Madinati, in my opinion, showed that there is a possibility to mobilize and to crack the system, even though it is extremely hegemonic and entrenched. And it is not impossible. And that mere lack of impossibility for me is something that's worth discussing and learning from. Okay, so what's next? Was this circumstantial? The critiques of Beirut Madinati, you'll hear a paper on that tomorrow, was that it was like a very elitist movement concentrated in the middle class and in the capital city that brought together people who were very alike without any connection to labor unions and similar political groups. So very easy to co-opt, to be divided, to be repressed, and that it won't lead very far. I would like to argue that Beirut Madinati did expand the space for urban politics, or for what Julian called this morning urban political, what did you call it? Urban political action? Yeah, I think that would be more what I would tend towards. And can this grow? Can this network? Can this grow beyond Beirut and go beyond urban claims? That would be a question to answer in the future, and I will stop with that. Really sorry to have taken more time than I should have, but thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Manar. First, immediately, and Farah, you owe me an apology because I stopped you at
Sorry.
You're right, 20 minutes. So, I had some comments, but I skipped on it. Basically. So, what time I was supposed to what time I was supposed to end this session? Because we started late and we ended the presentations late, so I was thinking to 4:30, right?
No, 5, I think 5. It's,
Okay,
yeah,
so
it's better to be at 5.
it's 4 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm not in a critical position. So I leave the floor. We have probably one question. If anyone would like to, if we have to respect the time, please. Up to you.
Mrs. Chair, can we decide?
5 o'clock, I think it's fair.
5 is the keynote.
I think we should stop at 10 to 5. This way people can grab coffee and come back. I
And
can come
five. So
listen.
we have like
Good.
2 minutes. Yeah, please. But very quickly and
Yeah,
quick.
I'll try and be
Awesome.
quick. So, as we were learning from Beirut Madinati and the waste crisis, I do hope that these cracks in the system will continue to lead us to organize and do something about it, because I think that's going to be more and more the case. Okay, so we're talking a lot about participatory approaches, and we're talking quite a bit about this kind of activism through participatory approaches. So I'm wondering, what kind of mechanisms do you think would work to actually allow people to sustainably? I mean, even in cases where usually we do participatory approaches when there's an issue, and then we kind of like let them fizzle out. So how do we keep them sustainable and continue to do their thing even after the solution seems like it's been created?
Thank you. Please. And then Mr. Abdullah.
My question is for Dimitri, especially on the infrastructural participation. I mean, most of us familiar with infrastructure understand that there's a sort of massive legal hurdles that regulate it and regulate who provides it and so on. So how has your example, the hydroelectric example, or any other, gone through that? Did they use the existing legal system, or was there a
Mona.
Thank you for great presentation. I'm also puzzled by the participatory infrastructure, and we're told to stay short, but the planner in me is revolting. So I have to ask a couple of questions that I think are really important. One of them is, as we start thinking of this situation where people produce their own infrastructure, what is it that we're doing to the first to the political, in the sense that if we look at what happened in Lebanon when we all gave up on the state and everyone started generating their own electricity, it's not so democratic. In fact, the way in which electricity generation is happening is that you're allowed by a political boss who hence becomes stronger to generate your own electricity. So that's one question. The second one has to do with how do we then regulate things that we know are actually potentially very environmentally damaging. Again, like when we start thinking that this is so decentralized and we idealize this sort of process, and we say it's not political at all, how do we regulate emissions, etc.? So I'll stop here, but I think we'll talk more on the coffee break.
Okay. I'll take advantage of my place here. I have one conceptual remark. I've noticed that, in almost all presentations, the state is part down to the regime. So when we talk about the state, as if unconsciously we're talking about the regime, and these are completely two different conceptual values, whether a sectarian regime, whether the market, whether the neoliberal regime. So in one sense, when we talk about a neoliberal state, it doesn't mean that the state has vanished or retreated. It means that the state has redeployed, in a sense that public institutions are serving the private interest, but the state is still there. And this is very important. That leads me to your three cases. Do these initiatives, whether the commons, whether the infrastructural projects, or urban movements, should exist independently from the state, not from the regime? And to what extent these urban movements should challenge the state, the regime, in order to take back the state? And this is what Beirut Madinati tried at some point to avoid, not necessarily explicitly accusing the regime that was in place. So can we really think about a life for these movements without necessarily thinking about the state as common as well? Because commons are about tangible and intangible resources and goods, but what links all these goods and resources are the state at some point. So, I'm sorry?
Can I throw in one question too before I'm done?
Yeah. So this is my first question, and it takes me back to Muna's. Are we creating a parallel state then, independent from all these, from the corrupt public institutions, neoliberal institutions, or we're trying to take back the state? So, yep.
So, just a quick question. I'll kind of restrain myself, but all these stories seem to be very small bore, right? So immediately you're framing so boldly imagines what do we do after the revolution, and the answer is instead of providing power and infrastructure to 300 or 400 million people, maybe a group of farmers in Thessaloniki have enough wasta to get power for their fields. And same with your story in Kuwait, which by the way was unbelievably depressing, right? I mean, in the end, power wins and just destroys what sounds like three amazing people and the people they could rally, and when they go on summer vacation, it's over. And Mona, your stories, some of them have equivocal endings. Maybe they won't end in failure, but we're living these stories. They're not victories, and even if they are victories, they're tiny, right? They're which is not to say they're pointless or anything else, but they're stop one appropriation of public space while 12 people appropriate an entire nation. So one question is there a different way of talking about this that is less small bore and less incremental and looking at little cases? And the other is just a conceptual question, which I pose as an outsider, which is that why are we talking about these as urban movements when these are just political movements? I mean, these sound like straight up political efforts to change dysfunctional or awful arrangements of power, and yet I'm hearing them described as if it's a different thing than politics. And anyway, that's it.
It's very clear. Last question, Lana, please.
It's okay.
Sure.
So my question is, what are the implications of studying yourselves, both for the production of knowledge and for action moving forward? Both for the production of knowledge and for action, for like doing more on this front as activists.
So the floor is yours. Dimitri, you start first, please.
Okay.
I think it's on, but you need to turn it on.
Okay. This magic machine, I'm not sure if it's working. Oh, I'm doing something wrong.
This one. No, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will hold off. No, okay. All right. The legal problem. Yes. If you ask anybody who's a commoner and involved in the commons movement, this is the first thing they ask you. I remember I was meeting people to start the research, and everybody was like, "Are you a lawyer?" I'm like, "I'm not." I don't have time to meet you. I say, "Okay, easy. We may be able to have a lawyer in that project." So yes, the legal problem is always there, and the state will use, as we know already, they see these movements as antagonistic, as competitive. On the one aspect, they admit their inability to cover the gap. At the same time, they see any infrastructural effort as, oh, these people are stepping on our top, right? So, and they will see that they're going to with that. But there is a problem there is an issue, and this is answering also partly other questions. There is also a legal gap. Infrastructural gap comes together with legal gap. For example, the 2.4 gigahertz, right? There is the reason we have Wi-Fi, the reason we have remote controls, the reason we have microwave ovens is very simple. Because when the USA state, as a first state, started regulating and basically privatizing the radio signal, basically, they couldn't privatize the 2.4 gigahertz because this is what the ovens, the microwave ovens are using in your home. And so every microwave owner would have to get a license. So they let it free. It is tiny. 2.4 gigahertz is tiny part of the electromagnetic fields. However, this is why we have Wi-Fi. This is why we got remote control. So there are always gaps there. And let me give you an example with the gap with the energy. According to the European Union policy, everybody who puts a solar collector and a solar panel in his roof, they get an interest-free interest from the banks, and then they produce energy which the electrical company is obliged to buy in a fixed price. Why was that fixed price? Because basically the first few years you pay back the banks. So the first 8 years you don't make any money, 7 years. After 7-8 years, usually owners start making money. More than 100,000 people did that in the roofs in Greece. It's a 10 million people country. 100,000 roofs or fields were filled with solar panels. There is a problem though. After the crisis, the European Union, the Greek state, every state don't believe anymore in the rule of law. So they are breaching contracts, the laws are like to be thrown out. So basically they change the price. So they breach the contract. So there is already basically the association of owners of micro solar producers takes the Greek state to the court, they win their freedom. So they may see a large-scale, self-organized producer of energy. Anyway, so there is full of legal gaps. Yes, the state will always try, or whatever we call state will try to go in and out. But at the same time, there is plenty of hope because infrastructural gap also means that the state is not able anymore to legalize, to the executive power and the legalization power are not anymore as effective as they used to be 10 or 15 years ago. So here you are. And a lot of times people will break the law. For example, Athens has one of the largest, people who have been in Athens may know that, has one of the largest free Wi-Fi internet network, right? With thousands, basically there are people who don't pay bills. Okay, this partly though answers the question of the political. And how, how basically, and the regulation and how it goes on. yes, we have a problem because you must obey certain environmental regulation. However, it's engineers who have to design all these things, and they are engineers regulated by the Association of Engineers of the Technical Agency of Greece. The architects, and all these people need basic, otherwise they lose their license. So these people are legal. So there is again the window. They use the gaps or non-gaps, so in this, in whichever way they manage to do that properly. Yes,
That was a zero.
yes. Okay, it was a zero. Okay.
Like
the
zero,
que-
like
it's-
0
no more
minutes.
Okay, I
No, because they need to,
Okay,
you know,
okay,
please.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and be really quick too. And in response, I guess to your question, it'll also maybe link to what you had asked. You know, I agree with you. I mean, these are definitely political movements in as much as they might be social. I don't think a lot of the ones, and there are several other examples that I'm looking at in Kuwait, would even refer to themselves as either. You know, a lot of these things like the garden and these very small, and I agree, we are speaking about these very small scale kind of movement projects or however we want to look at them. When we look at them collectively, I think we can see them on a larger sort of, from a larger vantage point. But a lot just began as responses to everyday life around them. You know, the garden, all of these things, they weren't actively initiated as ways of challenging the state or challenging any sort of, they were really just challenging the status quo of their everyday life that has characterized life in Kuwait over the last 60 years, a very suburbanized, privatized, isolated lifestyle. But over time, they sort of became more politicized when they started to get all of this pushback from state institutions. And then I think they started to develop a more political sense of themselves and started to realize the political role that they're playing, trying to push to get laws changed, and so on. But I don't even think a lot of these groups see themselves as being urban realized, or I see them more as urban movements because of the effect that they're having on the city and on how we approach and use the city and are reconnecting with the city in Kuwait. That was completely, I think, beside the point for them in some ways. Even the political protesters that I talked about in the beginning that occupied this space in the city, they were really, I mean, that was a clear challenge to the regime. I mean, that was very directed against the ruling, you know, members of the ruling family on corruption and so on. But in no way was that seen as an urban movement, but it was, because it completely was reappropriating using the city center for public protest for political purposes for the first time since the 1950s, since the Arab nationalist protests of the 50s. After that, public protest in the city center was banned. And so for that again, why I see it as in as much as it was an explicitly political movement, it was also indirectly an urban movement because it, for the first time, brought public protest back into the city center and reintroduced the space of politics in the city for the first time. But I think in response to your question, I think the problem becomes not only how do you develop mechanisms to allow these groups to sustain themselves after the solution, but how to sustain themselves in the face of all of this sort of pushback and resistance from the state. These are all really small, new, they don't really know how to do it. It's not as, in some ways, even developed as it's becoming here, where you have these different generations that are sort of passing things along to the next in activism. This is very, very new. So, and they're, you know, not a lot coming from the urban fields. And so they're developing or figuring things out as they go, but you can really lose momentum that way. Once, you know, after a while, you're just like, it's just not worth it anymore. So that's, I think, where the risk is, you know. And there's this risk, and I think people are becoming conscious of not wanting a space like the garden or these small scale things that are losing momentum, but there's also been this push to say we can't lose momentum because we just started, and what's the point then, you know, yeah.
Okay. I want to say that little empirical stories are good. I think we need to document little stories, even if they seem insignificant. I think we have a lot of good understanding of the macro, but we don't have an understanding of what's happening in the micro. I can understand that political scientists might find this insignificant. I find them very significant. And I think we learn a lot by tracing the genealogies of what appears to be small movements. So I think, and that responds partly to Lana's question, contribution to knowledge production. I think we can learn a lot about social movement theory, what works, what doesn't, the challenges, the opportunities, by understanding each of these urban activist group or coalition in detail, sociologically, historically. And I didn't have the time to go through that, but there's a lot to be done on that level. And it's an important intellectual contribution to understanding political change. How can urban activism lead to political change? We understand it much better by tracing these these micro case studies. I mean, that's my position at least. I also agree with the fact that that there are political movements. Of course there are, but they're also about the urban. And if we go back and read urban theorists, if we want a revolution to happen, it needs to be urban. La révolution urbaine is Lefebvre. Yani, if you read the book, we cannot have a revolution if it's not about spatial production processes. So these movements are conscious of that. They know this, and they are operating on the urban level with that in mind, that they want to claim back the urban, the public. They want to appropriate the commons. They want to live it. They don't want to only practice it. They are contesting the conceived. And I've talked to many of them. They know this literature, and they're operating accordingly. So I think the urban matters here, to name them urban. Now, I have more of a problem with social movement, the social. I'm not sure it's a social movement. I think it's more of an urban political movement, but we can discuss this later. The implication of studying this on ourselves and on action, I think it's a very important question. Thanks for asking it. I've learned a lot from doing this exercise on what we should have done better and what we should do next. And that goes back to your question, how to make them sustainable. I think we should identify other movements outside of Beirut, connect, network with them. There are a lot of things happening in relation to spatial production outside of the city of Beirut, outside of the capital. We saw municipal campaigns that took the name of Beirut Madinati elsewhere. I'm very curious of knowing who these people are, connecting with them, and this is how political change could happen. So it helps our urban activist agenda to read the literature, to reflect on what happened, to know what to do next. So there's this, and the importance of neighborhood-based action. And Beirut Madinati has a group who's working on neighborhood-based action now. The idea of building neighborhood units, that's key. And this is also a major, I mean, where is Dunya? Yeah. Dunya can comment on this. I mean, she's the coordinator of that unit. So you learn things by also reading about this literature. So I think it's a very productive process, at least for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone. Coffee break, 15 minutes, and then we'll be back.